The light December rain turned the streets of Detroit into dark mirrors, reflecting the neon glow of storefronts. But for 52-year-old Marcus Thompson, those same streets were just another place to survive one more night. His fingers trembled not only from the biting cold that pierced through the worn military coat he had been wearing for 3 years, but also from the cruel reality that a man who once served his country with honor now had to beg for spare change on the corner of Main Street. The cardboard sign in his hands, reading, "Veteran in hard times, any help appreciated," was soaked and starting to disintegrate, just like his hope that things might ever get better. What he didn't know was that within minutes, his life would take a turn that would test not only his endurance, but uncover secrets that would change everything forever. Police officer David Johnson, age 34, had been patrolling that block for 2 years and was tired of seeing the same bum on the same corner every day. To Johnson, veterans like Marcus were just another excuse not to work. People who used military service as a crutch to justify their laziness. It was a twisted belief he'd formed without ever having served a single day in the armed forces. When he saw Marcus holding out his hand to passers-by that frigid morning, something inside him ignited with an inexplicable anger. He couldn't explain why he felt so much contempt for this particular man, but there was something about Marcus that deeply disturbed him. What Johnson didn't know was that this encounter would unravel truths that would make him question everything he believed about honor, sacrifice, and the true meaning of service. "Hey you, get up now!" Johnson's authoritative voice sliced through the morning air like a blade, making Marcus slowly lift his eyes, not with fear, but with the tired resignation of someone who had already faced far worse. The veteran stood up with dignity, his aching legs protesting after hours sitting on the cold pavement, but he held himself upright with the posture the army had drilled into him decades ago. There was something in the way Marcus carried himself that irritated Johnson even more. A silent dignity that seemed to challenge his authority without saying a word. "You can't be out here begging for money. That's against city ordinance," Johnson declared, even though they both knew panhandlers had been tolerated in that area for years. What neither of them realized was that they were being watched by eyes that would soon recognize the injustice that was about to unfold. The tension in the air was palpable, as if the very atmosphere sensed something significant was about to happen. Marcus looked Johnson straight in the eye, and for a moment, the officer felt something strange, a feeling that this man had seen and endured things he could never even imagine. "Officer, I'm not causing trouble for anyone," Marcus said calmly but firmly, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had led men in battle. "Just trying to survive one more day." Johnson's anger surged, as if that controlled calmness was a personal insult to his authority. He had no idea he was about to make the biggest mistake of his career, one that would be witnessed by dozens of people and reach the ears of the only person who could truly recognize the value of the man he was about to humiliate. Fate had placed 2 worlds on a collision course, and the impact would be devastating for both. What began as a routine police encounter quickly turned into a public spectacle that would soon draw the attention of the entire community. Johnson, fueled by an arrogance that grew by the second, decided it wasn't enough to simply ask Marcus to move along. He wanted to make an example of him. He wanted everyone to know that the law was the law, and that he wouldn't tolerate bums in his patrol zone. "You think you can defy me with that superior attitude of yours?" Johnson shouted, his voice echoing down the street and causing pedestrians to stop and watch the scene unfold. Marcus remained silent, his hands at his sides, making no threatening move, but his instinctive military posture only irritated the officer more. What Johnson didn't notice was that every word he spoke, every aggressive gesture he made, was being recorded by the smartphones of onlookers now gathering around, forming a circle of witnesses that would soon become critical to everything that followed. "Empty your pockets, now!" The command came loaded with unnecessary hostility, and Marcus, well-versed in police protocol from his years of military training, complied without resistance. His hands trembled slightly, not out of fear, but from the deep frustration of being treated like this in the country he once risked his life to defend. The few belongings Marcus pulled from his pockets told a silent story. A few coins, a worn military ID, a faded photo of the family he'd lost, and a military medal he always kept hidden. Johnson grabbed the medal with disdain, examining it as if it were fake. "Where'd you steal this from?" he asked loudly, making sure the crowd could hear the accusation. The crowd began to murmur, some expressing visible discomfort at the way the veteran was being treated. Marcus clenched his fists for a brief second, fighting the urge to defend his honor, but forced himself to remain composed, knowing any reaction would be used against him. Things escalated when Johnson, realizing he had an audience, turned the moment into a public display of power. "Ladies and gentlemen, look at this. Another so-called war hero who'd rather beg than get a job." His words dripped with sarcasm and cruelty, prompting more people in the crowd to press record on their phones. Marcus felt each word like a punch to the gut, but he stood tall, staring straight ahead, as he had learned during years of military discipline. An elderly woman in the crowd shouted, "Leave the man alone!" But Johnson ignored her, lost in his performance of authority. What the officer didn't realize was that among the crowd was someone who not only recognized Marcus's face, but also knew the exact medal he was holding with such contempt. That person was trying to make their way to the front, but the crowd and the rising tension made it difficult. Time was running out, and Marcus's public humiliation was just beginning. "You want to know what I think about veterans like you?" Johnson continued, his voice growing louder and more venomous with each word. "I think you people make up these war stories to get pity from others. I bet you never even served." The accusation cut through the air like a bullet, and for the first time, Marcus visibly reacted, his eyes narrowing, jaw tightening. The crowd fell silent, realizing the officer had crossed a line he never should have crossed. Marcus took one step forward, and for a split second, Johnson saw something in the veteran's eyes that made him instinctively back off. A fire that came from a man who had faced death and returned to tell the tale. "I served my country with honor, officer," Marcus said, his voice low but filled with a quiet authority that made even Johnson hesitate. "And I don't need to prove that to you or anyone." It was the perfect moment for someone to intervene, but no one expected the intervention to come from someone completely unexpected, just minutes away, who would change everything. 28 years earlier, on a military base in Afghanistan, Sergeant Marcus Thompson was known for his exceptional leadership and his ability to stay calm under extreme pressure. He led an elite platoon assigned to one of the most dangerous missions in the region, protecting a convoy of medical supplies that needed to cross hostile territory to reach a field hospital where wounded soldiers desperately awaited treatment. Marcus wasn't just a soldier, he was a natural-born strategist, an engineer by education before enlisting, with an analytical mind that made him invaluable in combat situations. His family, a loving wife and 2 small children, were waiting for him back home in the United States, and he carried their photos everywhere, promising himself he would return to watch them grow up. But on that fateful morning, as he checked his team's equipment, Marcus had no idea he was about to face a situation that would not only define his military career, but also save the life of a young soldier who, decades later, would unknowingly become his accuser. The ambush happened exactly where Marcus had predicted, in a narrow pass between 2 rocky hills, where the enemy had complete tactical advantage. The first shot came from above, hitting the driver of the lead truck and causing the vehicle to flip violently, scattering medical supplies across the dusty road. Marcus immediately took control of the situation, shouting precise orders as he moved through the wreckage to rescue wounded soldiers. "Thompson, cover the left flank. Rodriguez, establish contact with base." His voice cut through the chaos of battle like a beacon in a storm, and his men responded instantly, trusting his command without hesitation. That's when he saw a young soldier, barely 19, and fresh out of training school, frozen in fear behind one of the overturned vehicles. The kid was in shock, unable to move, as enemy fire rained down around him. Without a second thought, Marcus left his safe position and sprinted through the crossfire to reach the terrified soldier, fully aware that this decision might cost him his life. "Look at me, soldier! What's your name?" Marcus shouted, grabbing the young man by the shoulders as explosions thundered around them. "David Johnson, sir," the boy stammered, his hands trembling uncontrollably as he tried to grip his weapon. Marcus saw the pure terror in his eyes, the kind of fear only those who had faced war could understand, and something paternal awakened in him. "Johnson, you're going to get out of here alive. I promise," Marcus said, his voice steady and reassuring even in the middle of chaos. "But I need you to trust me and do exactly as I say." Over the next 40 minutes, Marcus shielded Johnson like a father would a son, guiding him across the battlefield, teaching him how to move, how to breathe, how to survive. When the rescue finally arrived, Johnson was alive and relatively unharmed. But Marcus had taken shrapnel to the chest and leg, wounds that would haunt him forever. As he was being carried to the field hospital, Marcus heard Johnson crying out, "Thank you, Sergeant Thompson. I'll never forget what you did for me." But neither of them knew that the trauma of that day would eventually wipe those memories from Johnson's mind, leaving only emotional scars he could never fully explain. Back on the corner of Main Street, the situation was rapidly deteriorating. Fueled by his own arrogance, Johnson decided he needed backup to deal with what he called a problematic veteran. He exaggeratedly activated his radio, making sure the growing crowd could see his show of authority. "Dispatch, I need backup at the corner of Main and 5th Street. Suspect is resisting arrest," he lied boldly, fully aware that Marcus hadn't resisted in any way. Within minutes, 3 patrol cars arrived, and the officers who stepped out immediately sensed something was off. The crowd seemed more hostile toward them than toward the supposed criminal, and Marcus stood silently, hands visible, offering no obvious threat. But the presence of more officers only encouraged Johnson to escalate his performance. He began shoving Marcus, trying to provoke a reaction that would justify his increasingly aggressive behavior. Marcus, still holding on to his military composure, felt something stirring inside. Not fear, but a controlled anger he had learned to master during years of combat. Each shove from Johnson triggered memories of moments when he had been tested beyond his limits, yet had always found the strength to persevere. "You're not going to provoke me, officer," Marcus said in a low but steady voice, loud enough for Johnson to hear. "I've faced men far worse than you, in places where your courage would never be tested." The words, spoken with absolute calm, did something strange. Johnson felt a chill run through him, as if some deep part of his mind recognized that voice, that presence. He shook his head, confused, but his anger only grew. He signaled to the other officers that it was time to take action. What none of them knew was that someone in the crowd had already called the police station, not to support Johnson, but to report a case of police abuse. And that call was being routed directly to the desk of the chief of police. In the crowd that was growing by the minute, a desperate voice tried to rise above the noise. "I know this man. He's a hero," cried Margaret Sullivan, a 67-year-old retired nurse who had worked at the military hospital where Marcus had been treated after his final mission. She pushed her way through the people, holding in her hands a local newspaper from years ago, showing a photo of Marcus receiving a medal. "Officer, stop this! That man saved lives in Afghanistan." But Johnson, consumed by his display of power, ignored her completely, treating her like just another civilian trying to interfere with police business. Margaret finally got close enough to tap one of the other officers on the arm, showing him the newspaper photo. But the officer gently brushed her aside, saying they couldn't interfere with Johnson's operation. What Margaret didn't realize was that her voice was being picked up on multiple cell phone recordings, videos that were already spreading across social media, generating public pressure that would soon reach the highest authorities. Marcus heard Margaret's voice, and for a moment, his eyes welled up, not with sadness, but with a deep gratitude, knowing someone still remembered who he truly was. He tried to give her a discreet wave, a subtle gesture of recognition, which did not go unnoticed by Johnson. "So you've got friends in the crowd now?" The officer sneered, his voice dripping with cruel sarcasm. "How about all of you back off and let the adults do their job?" The crowd grew louder, some shouting, "Abuse of power," and "Leave the veteran alone." But Johnson took this as validation that he was handling a serious situation. He didn't realize he was digging his own professional grave with every word and gesture. Somewhere downtown, a call was being made to a number that would change everything, the personal phone of the chief of police, who had just stepped out of a meeting about improving relations between police and veterans in the community. The most humiliating moment of Marcus Thompson's life was about to unfold in front of dozens of witnesses when Officer Johnson decided it was time to show who was really in charge. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back," he ordered with sadistic satisfaction, pulling the handcuffs from his belt like a trophy. Marcus obeyed slowly, every movement weighted with a dignity that clashed harshly with the unnecessary brutality being used against him. The metallic click of the cuffs echoed down the silent street, and many in the crowd lowered their heads, unable to watch such blatant injustice. Johnson deliberately tightened the cuffs more than necessary, and Marcus closed his eyes, not from physical pain, but from the emotional wound of realizing how far his life had fallen. "Now everyone can see what happens when you think you can defy authority," Johnson declared loudly, turning Marcus around so the crowd could see the veteran in chains. What he didn't know was that with every passing second, his career was being destroyed by his own hand. The silent tears on Marcus's face were not of self-pity, but of deep sorrow for the humanity he had once defended, now treating him like a criminal. He thought of his brothers who died in combat, of all the sacrifices made in the belief they were protecting something greater than themselves. "My friends died for this freedom," Marcus murmured, his voice almost inaudible, but loaded with an emotion that made even some of the other officers shift uncomfortably. Johnson heard the words and laughed cruelly. "Freedom? The only thing you fought for was the right to be a bum." The crowd erupted in outrage, people shouting, some even trying to get closer, but the other officers formed a barrier. Amid the chaos, Margaret Sullivan finally managed to shout loud enough to be heard, "His name is Marcus Thompson. He saved my son in Afghanistan." But her words were drowned in the commotion, and Johnson continued his public humiliation, unaware that fate was already moving to correct him in the most devastating way. The roar of a police cruiser engine sliced through the tense morning air as Chief of Police Michael Harrison arrived on the scene, lights still flashing, his face hardened with a seriousness that made every officer straighten up the moment they saw him. Harrison had received multiple reports of police abuse and decided to check it out himself. But when his eyes landed on the cuffed figure of Marcus Thompson, something extraordinary happened. Time seemed to freeze. His hands began to tremble uncontrollably as memories buried deep by decades of post-war trauma surged back like an avalanche. Sand, explosions, and a strong voice shouting, "Look at me, soldier. What's your name?" Harrison instantly remembered his own trembling reply. "David Johnson, sir." But it couldn't be. Michael Harrison had changed his name after the war, trying to escape the memories that haunted him. David Johnson was just a ghost of the past he had buried long ago. "Sergeant Thompson!" Harrison's voice came out as a strangled whisper, but it was so emotionally charged that the entire crowd went silent at once. Marcus slowly lifted his head, his eyes meeting the man who had become chief of police, and recognition struck them both like lightning. "My God, David Johnson," Marcus murmured, his voice a mix of shock and compassion. "You were so scared that day. I promised you'd make it out alive." Harrison collapsed to his knees in the middle of the street, tears pouring from his eyes as decades of guilt and unspoken gratitude exploded inside him. Officer Johnson, watching his superior crumble, looked between the two men in complete confusion, failing to understand the gravity of the scene unfolding before him. "Chief, what the hell is going on? You know this bum?" he asked, unaware that every word he spoke was digging a deeper hole for his own career. Still trembling, Chief Harrison stood and approached Marcus with a reverence that left everyone present in stunned silence. "Get those cuffs off him now," he ordered, his voice filled with decades of authority and long-buried emotion. The other officers moved without hesitation to free the veteran. "This man is not just a hero. He is the hero who saved my life in Afghanistan back in 1997, Harrison announced to the crowd, his voice cracking. "I was a 19-year-old soldier, terrified and frozen during an ambush, and Sergeant Marcus Thompson risked his life to protect me and guide me through the battlefield." The crowd began murmuring in disbelief, some filming every word, while Johnson stood frozen, the color draining from his face as the weight of his mistake settled on him. Marcus rubbed his wrists where the cuffs had left marks, but his eyes were locked on the man he'd once saved, seeing not a powerful police chief, but the terrified young man he had promised to protect. "Sergeant Thompson took shrapnel to the chest and leg protecting me," Harrison continued, now addressing the crowd that had become his audience. "He spent months in the hospital. His military career ended because of those wounds. And when he finally came home, he found his wife had died in a car crash, and his children had been placed in foster care because he was too injured to care for them." The revelation hit the crowd like a punch to the gut, and even Officer Johnson started to grasp the depth of his cruelty. "For years I searched for him, trying to thank him, trying to repay him, but he had vanished from the system. And now I find him like this, on the streets of my own city, being humiliated by one of my own officers." Harrison turned to Johnson with a gaze sharp enough to cut steel, his voice low and cold with controlled fury. "Do you have any idea what you've just done, Johnson? You've humiliated the man who is the reason I'm alive today." What happened next would become legend in the history of the Detroit Police Department, when Chief Michael Harrison did something no officer present had ever witnessed in their entire career. He knelt on the wet asphalt before Marcus Thompson, removed his hat and badge, and with a voice choked with emotion, spoke words that would echo forever in the memory of everyone there. "Sergeant Thompson, I ask for your forgiveness. Not just as Chief of Police, but as the soldier David Johnson, the young man you saved 28 years ago. I failed you. My city failed you. And this country failed you." The crowd went completely silent, many openly crying as they witnessed a moment of pure humanity and redemption. Marcus gently placed a hand on Harrison's shoulder, helping him to his feet, and for a moment, right there in the street, they were no longer a police chief and a homeless veteran. They were simply two soldiers who had shared the horrors of war and now found each other again on the other side of life. "David, you don't need to kneel to me," Marcus said softly, yet firmly. "You became a good man, a leader. That's all I could have hoped for from that scared kid I once protected." Officer Johnson, realizing his career had ended the moment he chose to humiliate Marcus, tried a desperate defense. "Chief, I didn't know. How could I have known who he was?" But Harrison turned to him with a stare that left no room for excuses. "You didn't need to know who he was specifically, Johnson. You needed to treat him with the dignity every human being deserves, especially a veteran who served this country." The crowd began to applaud as Harrison announced that Marcus would be immediately enrolled in a veteran housing program, receive full medical support, and be offered a job at the police department as an advisor for other vulnerable veterans. As for Officer Johnson, Harrison continued, his tone now cold and official, "He is suspended indefinitely, pending a full investigation into his conduct today. Behavior like this does not represent the values of this department." Johnson knew his law enforcement career was over, but what haunted him most wasn't the loss of his badge. It was the realization that he had attacked the very kind of man he was supposed to protect and honor. 6 months later, Marcus Thompson was unrecognizable, not just physically with new clothes and a small but dignified apartment, but spiritually renewed after finding purpose once again. His job as a veterans counselor at the police department had become a true calling, and each day he helped other former soldiers navigate the difficulties of civilian life, using his own experience on the streets to build bridges of trust and hope. The story of his encounter with Harrison had spread nationwide, inspiring changes in veteran care policies in dozens of American cities. Margaret Sullivan, the retired nurse who had tried to defend him on that fateful day, had become his closest friend and often visited him, bringing stories of other veterans who had been inspired by his journey. "You know, Marcus," she said during one of her visits, "maybe all of this happened for a reason. Your humiliation became the salvation of so many others." Marcus smiled, looking out the window of his office at the police department, where he could see the corner where it had all begun. "Sometimes the greatest purpose rises from the darkest moments," he replied, thinking of all the veterans who still needed to be found and helped. Officer Johnson never worked in law enforcement again, but strangely, his forced dismissal had become a disguised blessing, one it would take him years to fully understand. The public humiliation he faced forced him to confront his own biases and to seek therapy to deal with his unexplained anger, an anger that, he eventually discovered, stemmed from his own insecurity over never having served his country. 6 months after the incident, he appeared at Marcus's apartment door, not as the arrogant officer he once was, but as a broken man asking for forgiveness. "I don't expect you to forgive me," Johnson said, his words filled with a genuine humility Marcus had never seen before, "but I needed you to know that the man who attacked you wasn't who I really am." Marcus invited him in, and during a 2-hour conversation, something extraordinary happened. Johnson offered to volunteer for the Veterans Program, not out of guilt, but from a sincere desire to repair the harm he had caused. Today, he is one of the most dedicated volunteer coordinators in the program, and his personal transformation has become a powerful example that even in our darkest moments, redemption is possible. The corner of Main Street now bears a small commemorative plaque honoring all veterans, and Marcus passes by it every day on his way to work, reminded that sometimes we have to fall completely to discover who we truly are.